Hello and welcome back to our masterclass on preaching. My name is Ian White and right now we're going to take our next step towards crafting a sermon and start to think about the main idea that your sermon will contain. We're likening the crafting of a sermon to the creating of a bridge, and here's our bridge. On the one side we have the world of the Bible and on the other we have the world of today. And I'm recommending that you work on the Bible passage rather like this. Now, let's assume that our work on the Bible's text is complete. So, armed with all this stuff, we're now going to develop the single idea that will be at the heartbeat of your talk or your sermon. Now, as with all of the insights in this masterclass, you may well have your own way of doing it, especially if you're a regular preacher. You know, I'd really like to hear about what you do, and you can put it in the comments section below and we can share our journey together. You can probably see some symmetry here in our method, and that likely says more about me preferring things to be neat and tidy than it does about anything else, really. So the question for us to think about in this segment is, what will be the single thing, the main point that you want to get across? How might we go about finding the heartbeat of your sermon? This, it seems to me, boils down to asking, what do you want your congregation to remember from your talk? And I would encourage you to write it down as briefly and as succinctly and as clearly as possible. Now, it may take some time to work it out, and I quite often have several attempts before I settle on something I'm really happy with. Consider this. If 10 people were asked what you preached about today, would 7 of them give the same answer? Would it be the same as your answer? This highlights the principal difference, I think, between a sermon and a lecture. A lecture, and I've given a fair few of those, a lecture is a talk with many points. Often students will be taking notes and the focus is largely on information. A sermon, on the other hand, has one main point, and the focus is on inspiration, inspiring people to live for Jesus Christ. So in a sermon, we want to say one thing and say it well. The big idea of your sermon should really be similar to the big idea of the passage that you're studying. And if it isn't, just be clear with your own conscience that you're expounding the right text for this particular occasion. Now, I'm using the word locate deliberately because in my experience, it's going to be in there somewhere. And what I have to do is to dig for it. In fact, as I'm locating or trying to find my big idea, I sometimes think of myself as being a little bit like a metal detectorist. You go digging or searching for something and sometimes you find a single coin. Sometimes you hit on a whole hoard. So to locate the big idea, the heartbeat, I find myself asking some diagnostic questions like these. What can I say that will create a sense of awe and wonder? It may be to wonder at who God is or what Christ has done. It may be to wonder at how worship changes me. Or what can I say that will comfort the disturbed? It may be claiming a biblical promise that God knows your pain or is with you in your suffering. In every congregation, there are going to be people facing uncertainty and anxieties. And our task as preachers is never to gloss over these tough realities. I don't want to be guilty of just preaching happy talk. Conversely, I could ask the question, what can I say that will disturb the comfortable? It may be a challenge to live a different kind of lifestyle or to adopt a different pattern of thinking. But do beware and be careful of assuming that your audience is in any way complacent. For the most part, there are good reasons for our congregation members to behave the way they do, and it's our job to understand them and to minister to them where they're at. And that brings me to a fourth question. What can I say that will show my concern or my compassion for the people I'm speaking to? This was a factor that made Jesus' preaching distinctive in his day. Matthew tells us this: when Jesus saw the crowds, he had compassion on them because they were harassed and helpless, like sheep without a shepherd. And the gospel writers observe this often enough for us to notice it. It's a thing. My friend, how can I say this kindly? If you don't feel genuine compassion for the people you're preaching to, then do us all a favour and don't preach. Get out of the pulpit. If you find yourself preaching out of anger or frustration or envy, then deal with your own heart first before you assume the right to mess with anybody else's. I've heard too many sermons where the preacher has launched a verbal attack on his congregation, and it does tend to be us men who do it most, accusing them of not being sufficiently committed or not worshipping heartily enough or not giving enough or not praying enough. And the result is not more giving and more praying. The result is crushed people and often mystified people. Fundamentally then, what is the thing I most want people to remember when they listen to me speak? Say that one thing and say it well. To find that one thing, I will almost certainly need some digging. And when I reflect on this part of the process, I find some scriptures very reassuring in this regard. Consider Mary. She had a visitation from an angel, and she went also to visit her cousin who was also pregnant, and told her about her story. And Mary realised that she was going to be the mother of God's son. And Luke makes this telling comment. He says, Mary pondered these things in her heart. And when we do the same, the text becomes part of our thinking. I want to probe it like a bee probes the blossom. I want to play with it like a dog plays at a bone. I want to suck at it like a child with a milkshake. I want to chew on it like a cow chews the grass. And a cow has, 8 stomachs to digest it many times over. And all the time I'm crying humbly to God, Lord, please light up, please illuminate your word to my soul so that I can find the one thing that you want to say when I stand to speak to your people. Because if you can illuminate my soul, I'll then be equipped to illuminate theirs by your Spirit. And another scripture I find reassuring here is when Daniel was wrestling with God and trying to hear what the Lord was saying. Obviously, it was a very different situation from ours, but the principle still holds. And the angel said to Daniel, "Do not be afraid, Daniel. Since the first day that you set your mind to gain understanding and to humble yourself before your God, your words were heard, and I have come in response to them." So when I humble myself to hear the heartbeat of God from his word and to embed it in my words, angels can attend to guide me. And then when Paul in the New Testament was writing instructions for his protege Timothy, he just simply said, "Timothy, the Lord will grant you understanding." So hold those promises in your heart and scribble down your thoughts about what the heartbeat of your sermon is going to be. And don't be too worried if they come out as a bit of a jumble. Just try to tease out the one thing that you want people to take away and then write it in a single, easy to read sentence. Say one thing and say it well. Perhaps a couple of examples would help here. When I was preparing on the first chapter of Colossians, one of the ideas I wrote down, and one which I carried through into the message, was this: I thank God for all of you, and I want you to live for him. And that was the heartbeat of my message. Last Sunday, as it happened, I was preaching on Ruth chapter 1 from the Old Testament. And the heartbeat of my message was this: no matter where you are right now, God can bring you home. The idea is, I don't know how far away you've wandered, God still loves you and he can bring you back to a place where you can be fed. Let's suppose, for example, we were expounding the parable of the Good Samaritan. We could expound it and say that it talks about how important acts of service are for Christians, and that would be true. But it would miss the racial point that Jesus was making. That it was someone who was despised because of his ethnicity who was God's agent. It's an implied criticism of religion that doesn't extend love and care to the last and the least and the lowest. If we don't do that, Jesus implies our religion, however orthodox it is, however biblical it is, however many degrees we've got, and however tightly it follows a particular line or denominational approach, it's bogus. Jesus' message was Samaritan lives matter. This is Charles Simeon. He was a preacher in the early 19th century, and he wrote extensively on how to preach. He said this: I think every sermon should have like a telescope with but one object in its field. And he went on to say that once we've discovered that object, once we've found the heartbeat or our big idea, then we should write it down as a categorical proposition. Well, we're just calling it the heartbeat. You get the message. But then he goes on to say this: reduce your text to a simple proposition and lay it down. And then screw the word into the minds of your hearers. A screw is the strongest of all mechanical powers. When it has turned only a few times, scarcely any power can pull it out. I love that analogy, although today I don't suppose he ever used the idea of screwing up a sermon. I've screwed up enough of them. But you get what he's saying, and I think he's right. Here is John Stott. In our sermon preparation, we must not try to bypass the discipline of waiting patiently for the dominant thought to disclose itself. Then there will be no danger of unscrupulous text twisting. On the contrary, the Word of God will dominate our mind, set on fire our hearts, and later leave a lasting impression on the congregation. Say one thing and say it well. God bless you. Well, from here, you can like, you can subscribe, and you can share what you've just seen with some of your friends. So please do click around on the screen here, and you'll find some other things that I hope will help to bolster your ministry. You could be anywhere in the world right now, but you're right here, and I appreciate that enormously. God bless you.